we live in an era where we feel that we are entitled to pursue our desires, because this is the culture where I deserve to be happy.
It seems like most people all want the same thing. We want to be loved, we want to be treated well, we want them to care as much for us as we do for them.
Let me tell you something. God's way works.
Monogamy used to be one person for life. Today, monogamy is one person at a time.
Of all activities on the internet, porn has the most potential to become addictive.
Relationships are the single most important thing to you in your life. It's the source of all of your best memories. It's the source of all of your worst memories.
When you go into Facebook, you have to put down your relationship status. You can put that you are married. You can put that you are engaged. You can put that you are in a relationship. You can put even that you are in an open relationship. But the best one, the one that I always get a kick out of, is the one that says, it's complicated. It's complicated. Because I think that is probably the most honest Facebook statement that you could ever put up. That's the honest status, that it is complicated. All relationships are complicated. Your background is complicated. The situation that you find yourself in is complicated. The fact that you've had these different relationships in the past and you're trying to do this and you've got all these other things happening, it's complicated, complicated. And your problem with me is that you look at me as a minister, a church guy, standing on a little platform telling you what to do, and you know full well that your life is more complicated than I can give you proper advice for. You know that you are an individual, and we don't like people telling us what to do, because we know instinctively that our situation has a number of different wrinkles which might not be the same as the other guy in the row next to you. And so it's complicated, and we have problems with relationships, and we have problems trying to navigate this whole thing, because how do you know what to do, and how do you know what applies? And even if you do know what to do, sometimes you find that you have just not done the right thing, or you've got yourself into a situation which actually, if you'd thought about it, if you'd planned it, you wouldn't have gone down that route. And so it is complicated. And what I want to do is I want to, in a sense, I think what I want to do is I want to say, first of all, that when we find ourselves in complicated situations where there's been mistakes or where there's been regret or where there's been false missteps, God, I believe, is able to put things together. Last week, we talked about that Japanese art, the Japanese art of kintsugi. And if you were here last night, you'd have heard me talk about this. Actually, I didn't say it well enough. I didn't tell you the fact that when this pottery is broken, it's repaired not just with any ordinary resin in an artistic way. It's repaired with gold. It becomes more valuable, not just because of the craftsmanship, because it is intrinsically more valuable. Something broken, and yet that brokenness is celebrated, redeemed, and made beautiful, made strong. And the Bible says, you know, where there has been breakages in our lives, and where there's been compromise, and where there's been mistakes, God is able to make it good. But I just want to look at the whole thing of, it is complicated, and I get that, and I understand that it is complicated. Your situation, your heart, your relationships, your future, your past, it's complicated, and I wouldn't dare tell you what to do. But I do think that the principles of relationships are fundamentally simple. This is what the Bible says. It says, yes, working it out can be complicated. Understanding and trying to apply it to your life can be complicated. But do we know what the simple principles are? And then it becomes a case of, well, it's challenging to work out the principles. It is a real, something that's going to take a lot of help. It's going to take a lot of grace. But when you understand what the ideal is, it gives you something to aim for. It gives you something to shoot for. And so what I want to do tonight, I want to talk about commitment, and I want to talk about marriage. I want to talk about relationships. And I'm going to talk unashamedly about ideals, knowing full well that in the real world, it's not that simple. But the principles still hold. Now, the things that we struggle with, commitment, how can I stay together? What do you do when it goes pear-shaped? What do you do when you think you found the right person, but it's not going too well? These same things that we struggled with, they struggled with in the time of Jesus. There's a bunch of Pharisees who were like the religious elite in Jesus' day, and they came to Jesus and they had this particular question. They said, some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? In other words, I've got commitment issues. I'm in a married relationship. I'm committed to someone, but I want to know what I can do when I don't want to be committed anymore. How do I break that relationship? How do I divorce? Now, the background to this, without getting too technical, is that in those days, the school of religious thought split into two groups. One was liberal and one was conservative. Now, the conservatives said, you can't divorce your wife. It was a patriarchal society, so forgive me that it's all on the man. You can't divorce your wife unless she's unfaithful to you. Then you can do it, but only then. That's the conservatives. But the liberals said, and literally they said, if she burns your toast, that's grounds for divorce. You can divorce her. If you see someone more beautiful that walks down the road, divorce your wife, go for it. Because commitment is hard. How can you stay married to the same person? Particularly in those days, you didn't even choose your wife or choose your husband. It was kind of chosen for you. And you find yourself in this situation, and I want an out. And so what's Jesus going to say? Jesus says this, haven't you read? When he says, haven't you read? He's referring to the book of Genesis. Now, we looked at Genesis in our last series, Deal Breakers. If you haven't seen that, go back onto the website, because we talked about Genesis. We talked about the fact that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3, it's not literal scientific rationale for how the world came to be. It's a creation myth with a profound point. It's true, but the truth is put in words and in a format, in a genre that people could understand. And so it's not so much about how did the world come to being and how did creation take place. No, it's about who are we? How do things work? How do relationships work? And so when Jesus wants to find out an answer for people about relationships and how we do life, he goes back to this amazing book, Genesis. He says it's true. Don't get sidetracked with all this stuff about, well, it doesn't talk about the dinosaurs. Get with the program, what it's trying to say. How do we do life now? What is life all about? Who are we as people? What does it all mean? And he says this, haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? In other words, God has made us sexual beings. You know, he's made sexuality part of us. It's a God-given thing. It's a good thing. And then he says this amazing thing. The Creator not only made us, but the Creator said. And then he quotes the rest of Genesis. But this is the weird thing. He doesn't say Genesis says. He doesn't say Moses, who's technically the writer. He says God. And that's what we mean when we talk about the Bible. The Bible is fundamentally true and inspired by God. You can trust it to do exactly what it sets out to do, which is to give us truth. And sometimes it'll give us truth like Joey did in a poem. And sometimes it'll give us truth like I'm doing in a kind of straightforward talk. But it's all true. This is what God says. This is what the Bible says. But it's actually God's heart, God's words. He says this, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother. Everyone say leave. Father and mother, and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, the Pharisees, they come back and they say, well, Moses said that actually you could give your wife a certificate of divorce. You could just write out a little note, give it to her over the breakfast table and say, so divorced. And that's okay. And Jesus says, yeah, but he did that because it's complicated, because people are people, and because people mess up, and people are selfish, and people make bad choices, and sometimes people go down the wrong route. And so he says, because your hearts are hard, because you're not as loving as you should be, because you're not as gracious as you should be, he's given you a concession. But that's not what the original plan was. And so the disciples, they say to Jesus, they say, if this is the situation between husband and wife, it's better not to marry. If you're not really supposed to break that bond, if you're supposed to say committed to become flesh forever, well, I mean, the pressure that puts on you, better not to get married. And Jesus says this, and it's profound. Listen, not everyone can accept this word. And I just want you to know tonight, that's your get out of jail free card, okay? So if you don't like what I'm saying, then it's fine, because not everyone can accept it. It may not work for you. It may not seem right to you, and that's okay. And Jesus says, look, some of you are going to get this, and some of you can go with it, and others can't. He actually goes on, and what I'm going to do for the next section is I'm actually going to drop it into the Message translation because it's a more modern translation and it helps us with some of the stuff which we just don't have in our culture anymore. But it says this: marriage isn't for everyone. Some from birth, seemingly, never give marriage a thought. Others never get asked or are accepted. And some decide not to get married for kingdom reasons. In other words, they've made a conscious choice. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way that they've chosen to be because there are other things in life. But if you're capable of growing into the largeness of marriage, do it. And that kind of clues back into what we were talking about with singleness last week. But if we go back to the main thing, what I want to do is just talk you through this, that verse 5. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, what you hear here, and the reason you recognize this, is not just because it's in Genesis, the book of Genesis, the first couple of chapters, one's chapter 1, this part's chapter 2, but actually it's quoted over and over and over again in the Bible. It's like a fundamental, foundational, simple principle that if you get a hold of this, it would really, really serve you well. So Paul quotes it. The passage that we started off, for the letter to the Corinthians that we started the series off with. And he quotes it again to the Ephesian church. But Jesus himself says it, and this is what you hear at weddings. So at the very least, if you're not a church person, if you don't believe this kind of stuff, you're not into the God thing, or you're just checking it out, you're just taking your time, then at least you will know why they say this at weddings. For this reason, the man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. They're quoting the very first chapters of the Bible. Now, in the old version of the Bible, the King James Version, with the these and the thous, they use the word united. They don't use it as united. They use the word cleave. Everyone say cleave. Okay, so leave and cleave are the two things that we focus on. Everyone say leave and cleave. Okay, put your hands up if you know what the word cleave means. Okay, there's a reason that it doesn't appear in the modern translations. Cleave, it is, well, it's an old English word. It means to cling to. I know it sounds like you're cleaving something apart with a cleaver. You know, cleaver, marriage. But what it is, it's a clinging to. And the amazing thing is the Greek word that Jesus uses, it is a powerful, powerful word, but it's a surprising word. It's like, what, really? And that word is, without getting too technical, in fact, I won't even bother with the Greek. I'll just tell you what it means. It's two Greek words put together. One is towards, and the other is glue. It literally means towards glue. In other words, when a man leaves his mother and father, he shall be glued to. He shall be glued to his wife. Cleaving means that someone is glued, attached, connected into this kind of relationship. And what they're talking about one flesh. They're talking about sexual union. They're talking about that kind of physical intimacy in marriage. And some people, when they've read this and when they've heard Christians talk about it, they come up with a particular reaction. Maybe you come up with this reaction. And that is, that's just a whole load of putting too much on sex. You know, the idea that sex glues two people together. I mean, be real. Sex doesn't have to glue people together. Sex is just about making a connection, maybe, but it's a physical thing. It doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't have to bind me or bond me or glue me together for life. You ever see the film Avatar? Remember the film Avatar? Yes? I mean, it's like the biggest film of all time. So I'm guessing you've seen the film Avatar, right? Well, you know, when Jake, with the blue cat woman, and they get all Navi, and they do it Navi style. They get their little ponytails, they connect the ponytails, and then they do whatever blue cat giant creatures do. And then at the end of it, she says, Jake Sully, now we are bonded for life. At which point he thinks, I'm not sure that's quite what I was aiming for. You know, that wasn't bonding, that was braiding. You know, we are braided, and it was very nice. But this idea that it bonds you. But actually, I think there's a bit of a psychological basis in this. And the more that we discover about human relationships, the more we discover about human sexuality and connection and the neurochemical things happening in the brain, the more that we see, actually, there is something which is more than physical. It's physical, but it affects us. Put it this way. anything that is important to you, anything that matters to you in your mind and in your social relationships has an impact on your brain, your body, and your neurochemistry. So if you have your brain, you look at your brain, when you fall in love, your brain produces copious amounts of adrenaline, okay? Who here has ever been in love? Put your hands up. Okay, very good. My wife didn't put her hand up. Don't know what to do with that. But adrenaline courses through. That's why you have butterflies in your stomach when you see them. That's why you sometimes can't eat. You pine for them. Because what adrenaline does is it draws blood away from your stomach and areas like that and puts it into other areas of your body. But basically what it does is you can't sleep and you can't eat because you're just flooded with adrenaline. And even though you may be hungry, your body is saying, this is not a time to eat. This is a time to freak out because you're in love. When I met Kate, my wife, she's very hard to get, very hard to get. And I was just in love, but I literally butterflies, I couldn't eat, and I couldn't sleep for 2 months while she kept me at arm's bay. I just went through, and my body just was producing so much stuff. The worst thing in my life ever happened. I grew the most enormous spot on the top of my forehead. And it was like, no, this is the last thing I need in order to get this woman. But it was just adrenaline. Gets you freaky, gets you active, gets you moving, gets you ready to do something incredible to impress them. Adrenaline. Now, when you sleep with someone, when you have sex, there's other things that happen in your brain, which is what makes it enjoyable. Your brain releases different chemicals and hormones. 2 of the big ones are dopamine and serotonin. Now, if you've heard of those, you'll know that dopamine is kind of the fireworks chemical. That's the one that just gives you the incredible high and just makes you feel on top of the world. And serotonin, that's the one that kind of gives you a long-lasting sense of buzz, okay? Now, you can get those chemicals through other means. You can do a long run, or you can go boxing, get some adrenaline as well, and do physical exercise, dopamine comes. You can have a nice cup of hot chocolate, serotonin comes. But sex is a big way of just your brain firing up with all these things. And most people, that's where it stops. I know what it's like. I know the effect that it has on my body. When I fall in love, I feel that rush of adrenaline. And I know what it's like when I sleep with someone and we have sex together, because that's that kind of rush of pleasure, and then that's that great glow afterwards. But the thing that you might not realize is another little chemical, sneaky little chemical, being released. And while dopamine and serotonin are all about you and your high and how great you're feeling, this one is all about them. And it is called, you may have heard of this, it's called oxytocin. Oxytocin. Oxytocin, they call it the cuddle hormone or the love hormone. Basically, it's the hormone for human bonding, attachment, and social connection. And it is released when 2 people sleep together. And so there's something in this, Jake, we are bonded. It doesn't necessarily mean that you sleep with someone one time and that's it, I am now programmed, my brain has made me love them forever and ever. No, but what happens is there's a cumulative effect. If you sleep with someone, if you have sex with them, what happens is that stuff is happening in your brain that it naturally accelerates feelings of trust and attachment in a relationship. Now, do you think that men have oxytocin in their system? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. Do you think women have it? Yes. Okay. Who do you think has more robust systems of oxytocin in their biochemical makeup? Okay. If you say men, put your hand up. Okay. You're a fool. If you say women, I'm just joking. It's in women, and it makes sense because actually it's produced in massive quantities during pregnancy and particularly in childbirth. Why? Because when you give birth to that little kid, you need to be as attached as possible because that child needs to have as much parental input and support and care as humanly possible. It's not like an antelope. You've seen an antelope being born, little kind of unsteady, and then it's off. You know, it's hunting and it's... But with a human baby, I'm telling you, I've got 2 human babies. and they're all grown up. They take years. They take years. And so you need to be bonded. You need to be attached. And oxytocin produces that. And so by and large, in general, not always, most women have a stronger sense of oxytocin than most men. But what happens is that when you sleep together with somebody, oxytocin is produced in both partners. And oxytocin makes you, whether you like it or not, feel a sense of connection and attachment and trust with another person. And the more that you sleep with them, there's a cumulative effect, and it actually begins to wire your brain a particular way so that you become kind of chemically programmed, in a sense, to be more trusting to that person, which is a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a fantastic thing, unless it makes you make poor choices. Because if you get into a relationship and then you sleep with that person, you're now pushing your body into a system where you want to create something with that person, whether they're the right person or not. You are overriding, in a sense, your better instincts. And people that don't sleep together get the chance to find out about one another and see, are we really compatible? Are we going in the same direction? Does this have legs for the long haul? But when you sleep together, poof, you jump forward. What happens is that your body starts writing checks that your heart might not be able to cash. And your mind certainly didn't authorize. You can get into a situation where suddenly we just feel so much connection. We just feel so much chemistry. There's someone that I'm becoming imprinted upon. And now it becomes really, really, really hard to disengage because I've already kind of gone across that barrier. And so when the Bible's talking about glued together, I think this is part of it. Of course, it's not all chemicals and hormones and pituitary gland, but that's a part of it. And that explains that the human body, the human physique, the physiology and the neurochemistry of who we are as individuals, it's intricate, it's complicated. We are set up in such a way that there's a whole mechanism to give us the best chance to connect with another human being. But it is something which can be neglected and abused, and you can actually go against the grain of what your body is trying to make you do. And so when Jesus quotes Genesis and then says Genesis is actually from the very heart of God, he's saying God has created something that makes two one, cleaving, being joined to the other person. But just as important as cleaving is actually leaving. Everyone say leaving. Okay, now, in order to explain what I mean by this, what I'm saying is that the man, and again, it's funny because it was a patriarchal society, and yet it was the man that did the leaving, not the woman that has to be given away. It's the man that has to be given away, the man that has to leave. The man has to go from one circumstance to another circumstance. It talks about a definite transition point. Now, let me show you this. This is my best way to illustrate it. This is my iPhone. Okay. You've seen one of these before. Right. I am attached to my iPhone. My iPhone goes with me everywhere. My iPhone is always by my side. I look to my iPhone, speak to my iPhone, spend time with my iPhone all the time, as much as I can. I even have that thing, it's developed over the last few weeks, I swear, where I get that thing where I feel my iPhone vibrating in my back pocket, and then I reach out to my back pocket and I realize my iPhone isn't there. Have you had that? They call it false phone alert syndrome. I am so attached to my phone, my buttocks vibrate in sympathy when I haven't checked it enough. So I am attached to my iPhone, but I'm going to be honest with you here, and excuse me a moment of vulnerability. I'm not sure if I love my iPhone. The fact of the matter is, I've seen a Samsung, and those things are pretty sweet, and they can do things that this thing can't do. And actually, when I got my first iPhone, well, it was different, and it was actually smaller, and it's got bigger over the years. And now I just find it's a little bit too big. I don't like the fact that it feels this way in my hand, and they move the button from the top to the side, and the next thing I hear is they're going to make it impossible for me to put my headphones in them. I've got my nice AKG headphones. They're not going to fit into the slot because they're making it slimmer. I didn't want a slimmer one. I don't want a bigger one. I used to love iTunes, and then they changed it. They made it music. Music blows. It's so difficult to use. It's so awkward, so unintuitive. And the podcast thing, don't get me started. And then they keep putting stuff on there that I don't want. I don't want your watch. I'm not going to get your watch. Keep the software off my phone. So I should get rid of my iPhone. I should get to the Samsung. But you know why I won't? It's just, complicated. When I first got my iPhone, I'm not saying that I was incredibly, I had loads of other phones. Well, I had a few other phones, I had a Sony, I tried a Nokia, I had a little brief relationship with an Alcatel. But when the iPhone came along, I thought, this is the one. This is the one. I love it. It's beautiful. And then what happened is that as I started going down the road with my iPhone, the iPhone said, hey, why don't you kind of move some of your stuff over to me? Why don't you move some of your stuff over to where I am? And so it seemed like a nice thing. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I took all my music. I used to have CDs. But I took all my music and I made them MP3s. And I put them on my phone. And now if I had to change my phone, it'd be a huge faff because all my music is on there. Not to mention all my contacts and all my diary and all my to-do list and all my notes. And it's quite nice, but we had an iPad together. We had an iPad together, and then the family grew, and so we've now got MacBooks and desktops and iMacs and Apple TVs, and, it's quite convenient because they all talk to one another. And so if I was to move away from my phone, even though I don't really like it as much as I did, even though I feel like I wasn't quite aware that I was signing up for an iPhone for the rest of my life, every single time that comes out, every 2 years, buy the next one, and yet it's just too much of a faff. Psychologists call this inertia. Inertia means you get yourself into a situation and there's just too much faff to change, even if it's not ideal. Now, where am I going with this? I'll tell you. What it has to do with, the bearing that it has on relationships, is that many people, they get into relationships like they get into a relationship with their phone. One thing leads to another thing, leads to the next thing. And so you are casually dating, and then you begin to serious date. You're serious dating, and then you go from, kind of light physical peck on the cheek to a lot more than a peck, and suddenly you're into a full-blown sexual relationship. And then you start staying overnight because, it just makes sense. Why get up? Why leave now? Just stay. And then before you know it, you're moving some stuff into each other's properties. And then before you know it, there's that conversation, well, I like you. I feel it's going pretty good. Yeah, it's going. Would you like to move in? And then before you know, you've got a place together. And then things move from one to the next to the next. And they talked about that in the video. Things just naturally kind of progress, and you find yourself getting drawn in. And then by the time that you know what's happening, you're in a house together with a shared mortgage, shared bank account, and all this other stuff. And to change it, to move out, would be a faff, a huge annoyance, a nuisance. You'd have to do so much. It's just not worth it. But what you get, and what you end up with, and then they say, well, I'm going to have a baby. Yay, I guess we better get married. And you get married, and you get into a relationship, and it's not ideal. It's not as good. Now, here's the thing. Most people think that living together before marriage, and that's the norm now, so don't feel bad, but that is the absolute norm. Most people think, well, that's a great, wise way of working out whether you're the right person for each other. And that's something that you should be encouraged to do. It should work out. It should lead to better outcomes. But the reality is, it doesn't. Because you find yourself in a relationship that you've kind of just slipped into without really thinking about it. And there are certain things that psychologists say that will keep a relationship between two people that are not married together. Okay, so having a mortgage together keeps you in that relationship. Having a future holiday planned together keeps you in that relationship. Having a pet together keeps you in the relationship. Having a child together has no bearing whatsoever in staying in the relationship. Which is why in our society, in our culture today, a child of 15 years old is more likely to have one of these, a smartphone, than one of these, a father that lives with them. Now, what we call this, we call it sliding versus deciding. So sliding rather than deciding means that you have just slid from one transition to the next. You haven't really thought it. You haven't really chosen it. A bit like my iPhone. I got an iPhone because I wanted a phone, but suddenly I've got a personal assistant who speaks to me in an annoying voice that I can't get rid of. And I didn't decide that, but somehow I slid into it. And in relationships, if you just go through the stages because that's what happens next, what happens is that you find yourself at a certain point in a relationship and it's incredibly constraining because every time you go through a transition, it ups the level of commitment and it decreases the level of choice that you've got. Your options are now limited. And you get yourself into a situation where you think, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted, a good time. And you get research, and it's decades of research into people living together before marriage, shows that you have lower levels of satisfaction and lower levels of stability. And you're much more likely to get divorced if you get married after living with someone than if you haven't lived with them, which kind of is, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? It's not always, it's just generalizations. And actually, there's some group of people for whom that won't be the case. Actually, you have about the same chance if you're older, for example, or if you've never lived with someone else before. But for most people, it's not a good play. It's not a good option because you're going through these transitions. You've not decided them. You've not chosen them. You've not made a distinct decision in your mind. You've slid into them. And as you go through transitions, you need to know that transition is not transformation. Transformation where I'm changed. I'm now willing to take something on. Transformation comes because I make a choice. Transformation comes because I've worked on my character. Transformation comes because I've put some values and I've invested into them and I've made something a conscious decision. But just going through transitions and hoping that they'll change. Well, let's get married. That will make us feel more committed. Wrong. Doesn't work like that. And so what the Bible is essentially saying is it's saying, look, make the big break. Don't go through a kind of transitionary phase where you just go from one thing to the next and before you know, I guess we better get married. We've got all these other things. The Bible says this is the simplest way to do it. This is the easiest way to do it. You make a decision and you make a direct jump from one thing to the next. Of course, there's a period of adjustment and engagement and going out and finding out if they're the one and all those kinds of things. But without putting all those other things in that muddy the waters. And actually saving, and this is why I think it's brilliant, that leaving and cleaving go together. Leaving and cleaving because the one helps the other. In effect, leaving is context. Okay, so I'm moving from one thing to the other. And cleaving is sex. So I've got my context and I've got my sex. And sex, as we've already said, sex and context, they go together. They matter. So here's a little bit of a little rhyming thing. I know Joe was coming in, so I wanted to do my own poem. Context affects sex. Everyone say context affects sex. Context affects sex. It really, really does. In the wrong context, sex out of context wrecks. It has the ability, that if there's a marriage and someone sleeps outside the bounds of that marriage, actually, well, in a very real way, you kill the marriage. It wrecks the marriage. That's it. The marriage is over. Now, in many cases, you can remake a new marriage or you can remake a new relationship, but it does kill fundamentally what you had before. Something different comes and takes its place. But sex, in context, protects. Why? Because I am bonded to you, Jake Sully. Because we share something, and we've built something, and we've made the right choices, and we've chosen this. And that's why these words are used at marriage ceremonies, that someone would make a distinct decision, because when we make decisions, we have better follow-through. When we just get into something because it's just what happens next, we have worse outcomes. And so that's why Jesus says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. The two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. That is the goal. That is the ideal. It's complicated, I know, but at the heart of it, the principles are simple. The principles might need incredible help and work. And in 2 weeks' time, please don't miss this. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about how love really works and how God can help us do it. Because this stuff, it's like the disciples. You just feel like, well, who can get married? Who can live up to that? That's too much to us. It's too idealistic. It's a fairy tale. It's a fantasy. But God says, no, with my help, you can do it. And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have an interview with two people who had such a rocky, difficult marriage that they split up. And God brought them back together. And they're now happier than they ever imagined they could possibly be. And so, what God has joined together, let no one separate. It doesn't say who joined together. Who God has joined together, let no one separate. Hey, Philip and Kate, they're such a sweet couple. They're so perfect for one another. It's like God has joined Philip and God has joined Kate. But no, that's not what he's saying. He's saying what? What? Not who. What? What has God joined together? He's joined that act of sex. He's joined that act of physical intimacy. He's joined it so that it becomes something holy, sacred, and reflective of who he is. And it becomes something which speaks in the words of Song of Songs, stronger than the grave. Many waters can't quench this, raging like a fire. Something that you couldn't give all of your treasures and all of your money and all of your salary for. It would be scorned. And so to have that sense that the two could become one, that intimacy requires exclusivity, that you would be mine and mine alone, and that I could bring into our marriage a sense of fidelity and sexual boundaries. And I love the fact that with Ed and Ruth, in their story, they talked about the ways that actually they crossed that line. But that was not the end of it, because God is a God who says it doesn't matter if you've made mistakes. It doesn't matter if you haven't gone the way that you thought you wanted to go. I have the ability to make it good anyway, because I am a good God, and I can make you whole. But their story is a great one. It's a story that says, yes, we had a sexual history that was unbounded. And then we came into a relationship with one another, and we continued an unbounded sexual history with one another. But we got to a point where we realized that what God says and what the Bible talks about actually makes sense. Worth pitching for, worth shooting for. And so we asked God to help us. And now our story is that we know that we have been bounded in our sexuality with one another. There is something strong at the very heart of our relationship. And when I go into a relationship with someone that I'm going to marry, I'm able to say to them, not just because we bought a pet together, I'm able to say, I'm choosing you, I'm definite, I'm putting all my chips on black, in sickness, in health, richer and poorer, no matter what, till death us do part. Therefore, I'm expecting hard times. Therefore, I'm expecting difficulty. Therefore, I'm expecting it's going to be complicated. But I'll be held in. I'll be held in. And sex in context will protect. And sometimes that will go through different patches and rocky times, but this is the best shot that we have. So here is the big idea. Leaving and cleaving puts sex into context, turns sliders into deciders, and helps two become one. And that's the goal that we're after. That's the thing that we all want. We all want to have that special someone. And it's a wonderful thing that I can say to my wife, I never slept with anyone that I wasn't married to, even when it was you. I wouldn't even breach that gap, and you wouldn't breach that boundary. And we've built something of solidity, something that stood a test in our relationship. It's not easy, it doesn't always work out. Marriages do fail, even Christian marriages. But this gives us our best chance, because God, the Creator, said, this is what we do so that two become one. I'd like us to pray. Dear God, we thank you for your wisdom on relationships. Dear God, we thank you that you made us sexual beings with sexual longings and a chemistry that automatically wires us to another person in a profound and intimate way. I want to pray, Lord, for those of us that are struggling. I want to pray for those of us that feel broken in this area. And I want to pray that we'd find your wholeness. I want to pray that we'd find you weaving gold into our regret. And I want to pray that you'd help us to be people that are able to write a new story for one another, write a new story for ourselves, and find wholeness and freedom in Jesus' name. Amen.